Our first session of today is about toxicology and risk assessment. In recent years, there have been significant advances in the understanding of mineral oil hydrocarbons in food and their potential risk to health. But there are still gaps in assessing the risk for consumer health, and there is clearly a lack of additional toxicological studies, in particular on the MOA fraction. In 2012, EFSA published an opinion concluding that exposure to non-food grade mineral oil hydrocarbons posed a potential health concern, but that there is a significant uncertainty due to knowledge gaps. Our first speaker in this session is Marco Binaglia from the European Food Safety Authority. Marco joined EFSA in 2010 as Senior Scientific Officer Toxicologist. He currently holds this position with the role of team leader of the team on contaminants and the unit on biological hazards and contaminants. The title of his lecture is Toxicology and, EFSA Assessment of Mineral Oil Hydrocarbons in Food. Sorry, Marco. So we are all very curious what has changed in the meantime with regard to the assessment of MOSH and MOA. So let's dive in. Please, Marco, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning to all. I'll share immediately my screen. Let me know when you can see it, please.
Yes, we can see it, but not in the presentation.
Okay, I'll switch to presentation. Yeah, I'll switch to presentation mode. Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you. So this is the highlights of my presentation. I will try to cover the main points of the 2012 risk assessment that was just mentioned, and in relation to MOA, I will also cover the more recent urgent assessment that we have carried out in 2019, and then try to underline some general conclusion and considerations from both for MOSH and MOA. So, okay, just for those of you that are maybe less familiar with the way we work in EFSA, in particular in risk assessment for food and feed contaminants, we rely on published data mostly for hazard identification and characterization, so toxicological studies published in public literature. We also rely sporadically, let's say, on unpublished study reports that are shared on voluntary basis by study owners, generally by industry. For exposure assessment, instead, we rely mainly on data on occurrence of the contaminants in food and feed submitted by stakeholders, generally member states, but not only, also other stakeholders, and also data on consumption that we regularly collate via the various national surveys. And then, of course, from the comparison, as generally done for risk assessment, from the comparison of the conclusion on the hazard and exposure, we draw conclusions on the risk characterizations. Just to give you a general context, I guess most of you are very well aware of this, but everything started back in 2008. I started with an incident where several batches of sunflower oil were contaminated with high level of mineral oil hydrocarbons and imported in the EU. At the time, EFSA was requested to provide an urgent assessment, and initially the assessment was carried out assuming that this contamination was caused only by saturated, so by MOSH, by saturated hydrocarbons. A statement was published in that direction. However, later, in 2009, it was found that actually from 17 to 24% of the contamination was due to aromatic hydrocarbons. Following this, EFSA was requested by the European Commission to provide a more comprehensive risk assessment and this request was addressed by the 2012 opinion of the Contam panel. Following this opinion, a number of gaps were identified. EFSA decided to sponsor a study to fill some of these gaps in relation to the saturated hydrocarbons. And this studies, EFSA-sponsored studies, was published in 2017. I will cover very quickly some aspects of this study in my presentation. And then in 2019, there is the last outputs published by EFSA was delivered in 2019. As I said before, this was another urgent assessment focusing on MOA, and this was in response to findings of aromatic hydrocarbons in infant formula. Okay, I will not go to the chemistry. I think you all are very well aware of what MOSH and MOA are, and just a reminder, within the MOA, we generally focus and we like to have more information about a specific subfamily of the MOA, that is the 3 to 7 ring polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. They are called 3 to 7 ring MOA or 3 to 7 ring PAC. This corresponds, this definition, let's say, corresponds. Just another point to clarify before I start really digging into the presentation. Hydrocarbons are dealt by EFSA in different remits. There are some mineral hydrocarbons that are regulated products, mainly for the use as food additives, but also as pesticides. These are defined as these white oils. They are basically MOSH. They are free of aromatic hydrocarbons or virtually free of aromatic hydrocarbons. They are relatively well-defined products. We are still speaking about very complex mixtures, very complex substances. And also they are used in very clearly defined application intended uses. What we covered in the Contam field, in the Contam area, is the other, all the other oils, all the other mineral oils that end up in food via different sources of contamination. We'll see later there are multiple sources of contamination. There is likely a widespread contamination. Of course, we lose the information about the type of products that contaminate food. So there is an unknown composition of the mixture of oils that are present in food. So the dietary exposure is so to say, a mixture of the various mixtures, the various substances which are, let's say, mixtures of compounds, chemical compounds. And of course, we see that both saturated and aromatic hydrocarbons are present in foods. Just a few words about the sources of contamination. It was mentioned before. We think that several sources contribute to the contamination of food by mineral oil hydrocarbons. Likely the main sources of contamination are the environment. So hydrocarbons released in the environment via different sources, as you can see here, just to cite some of them. And then from the environment that can transfer into food. Another possibility is food processing, for instance, release agent in bakery products, although some of these these processes are not probably not very commonly used anymore. But for instance, transfer of lubricants from food producing machines, for instance, or from other type of machines and then ending up into food. Also, the migration from food contact material is a possible source. We know very well it was very much studied in the past. I think it was also one of the issues triggering the 2010 mandate from the European Commission. One difficulty is that depending on the source of contamination, the composition of the oils varies. An additional difficulty is that for many foods, as I said before, there are multiple sources that can contribute to the presence of mineral oil hydrocarbons. Of course, we are not totally sure that we have identified all the sources, and it is assumed that unidentified sources may exist. Because of the analytical method difficulties, although the composition of the oils is source specific, so changes from one source to another, when analyzing the presence of these oils, all these hydrocarbons in food, the information about the different compositions are lost in the analytical humps. And therefore, the analytical limitation preclude the possibility to identify sources just from the analysis. This is just to give you an example. This is an illustration we included in the previous opinion. This is not based on real data. It's kind of expert knowledge information that was put into a figure. But for instance, in case of rice, there may be, as I said before, several sources, and each one could contribute, let's say, more or less frequently. Let's say, for instance, the environmental contamination is probably a very low contamination, but occurring in almost all the samples. And then there are other types of contamination that can occur depending on the life of the food product. Let's say, for instance, food packaging in jute bags that are illegal now. Jute bags produced from batch oils. They are illegal in Europe, but they can still be used, for instance, outside Europe, where some food are produced and then imported into Europe. Paperboard packing, anti-dusting agents, or other oils used as spraying agent for particular foods. Transfer from lubricating oils during the harvesting, etc., etc., etc. Okay, I will not spend much time on the discussion of analytical methods that were very well covered from the previous presentation by Christophe, and also the JRC report where the method of choice is described, was also well described before. So I will just go to the next slide about exposure to MOSH. Actually, we have worked on, we have tried to estimate exposure to MOSH only once in 2012 in the main, let's say, EFSA opinion. At that time, we relied on a rather low number of data, only less than 1,500 results, mainly provided by a Swiss laboratory in Zurich, but also from there were a few data from other European countries. Most of the data were in these two time ranges, from 1997 to 2000 and from 2008 to 2010. The food
Marco, you are off right now. We cannot hear you. Now you're back. Perfect.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now you're back.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
Okay. The average chronic exposure in oils ranged from 0.03 to 0.07 milligram per kilogram body weight per day, and went up to 0.1 milligram per kilogram body weight per day for high consumers. And the age group with the highest exposure estimates were the children from 3 to 10 years old, with, you see, exposure ranging from 0.17 and up to 0.32 for average and high consumers, respectively. We also had at the time ad hoc scenarios for a specific situation of the bread and rice. This is because we noted very high average concentration in these two food groups. Looking at the way data were distributed, we could, for both bread and rice, we could identify two distributions. And then we decided to isolate, let's say, the high distribution data in a specific scenario. So we used the lower distribution average for the background scenario that I covered in the previous slide. And then we took the average for the high distribution for bread and rice, and we carried out a specific scenario for these two high distributions. You can see that it was really high. We think that this was due to specific uses that were done at the time with that were done at the time with MOSH, in particular releasing agent for bread and spraying agents for rice. Using this two high distribution, we came up with exposure level up to 6.4 milligram per kilogram body weight per day for bread and 1.3 milligram per kilogram body weight for rice, so much higher than the background exposure levels I showed you before. Another specific scenario was carried out for release from food contact material, in particular for recycled paperboard. We used specifically data from two surveys where food packaged in recycled paperboard was and without functional barrier was monitored, and in that case the concentration that were found in food were higher than the overall mean of the same food group, let's say. And this led to the general conclusion that basically at the time at least, the migration from recycled paper and paperboard could contribute up to 30% of the overall presence of mineral hydrocarbons in some specific foods. For instance, you can see here for breakfast cereals, about 30% of the exposure could really be due to the transfer from the packaging. We had much less data in 2010-2012 for MOA, and at the time we could not really carry out any exposure estimate for MOA. From the data available, it was estimated that the MOA fraction, exposure to MOA could be from 15 up to 35% of the total exposure to the oil hydrocarbons. As I said before, more recently we focused more on MOA because of these findings of MOA in infant formula. So this happened in 2019. We were asked by Commission to carry out a very quick risk assessment. This was based eventually on very few results. We focused on samples where the presence of MOA was quantified. And basically this ended up in very few results from Foodwatch, NGO that firstly indicated this presence of MOA, from data from Austria, and then from additional data we received from the Specialized Nutrition Europe, so from Trade Federation, European Trade Federation. Using these results, we came up with an assumed presence of MOA in this food product ranging from 0.2 to 3 milligram per kilogram. This is not a real average, of course. And using this data, we ended up into an estimate of mean dietary exposure ranging from 0.8 to 45 microgram per kilogram body weight for infants, and from 0.4 to up to 13 microgram per kilo body weight per day, of course, for toddlers. A few words about the toxicity, toxicology of these substances. So, of course, the main distinction in between MOSH and MOA. For MOSH, in general, we can say that they are of low biological activity. They don't react very much with biological tissues, etc. They are slowly metabolized and excreted. One main issue of several MOSH is bioaccumulation.